In 1989, a fellow named Russell Guy flew to Estonia to buy 1,000,000 sheets of paper for $250,000. Obviously, they weren't just any pieces of paper. They were Soviet maps. And they weren't maps of the Soviet Union. They were maps of the West. Maps of London, Paris, New York, San Francisco, and Chicago, and so on. The Soviets spent more money and more time on their maps of us than we did. They knew our streets, our factories, our military installations better than we did. That's the thing about militaristic, totalitarian governments. They really get to know the enemy well. So well that Russell Guy was willing to pay $250,000 for 1,000,000 of them and make a huge profit reselling them to government agencies and urban developers. So yeah, London, Paris, New York, San Francisco, Chicago, and of all places, the Niagara frontier. If you think about it for just a second, it becomes obvious. What do we have here that the Ruskies would want to drop a nuke on? Why, the GM axle factory in Tonawanda and the GM powertrain plant about a mile that way, right here in St. Catharines. They didn't bother with the Ford factories for obvious reasons. But the GM factories, all primary targets in a tactical nuclear war. My entire childhood was spent in a kind of dread of nuclear war. Some of you might remember something called a civil defense drill. The government produced film videos for elementary schools. You can find them on the YouTube if you want to see them. Basically, if you heard the air raid siren or if you saw a flash of bright light in the sky, your job as an 8-year-old boy was to leap from your bicycle and hide in a ditch or behind a concrete parking block. Or if you were in school, you were supposed to dive under your classroom desk because, as everyone knows, 7/8 of an inch of wood stops dead all the energy of 10 or 15 thermonuclear warheads. I grew up near Pensacola, Florida, a U.S. naval base. So we all knew deep down we'd be goners if we ever saw that bright flash of light. Popular fear was in popular culture. Every other movie, it seemed, was about the post-apocalyptic dystopian future. Movies like Mad Max, Failsafe, Red Dawn, and Blade Runner. There was a TV miniseries called The Day After. Some pop music groups made nuclear disarmament their reason of being. There were nuclear-free zones, which would have been obliterated with the rest of us. It was a great time to be alive. The end of the world was always at hand. Television preachers made a very nice living by demonstrating beyond the shadow of a doubt that the Russian commies fulfilled this prophecy or that prediction. They'd argue with each other about the time and the hour of this nuclear conflagration, which would bring on this mistaken notion of a rapture. And when the predicted time and hour passed by without the expected rapture, they'd go back to their prophecies and predictions, overlay the Soviet Union on it, and recalculate the day of the Son of Man in utter defiance of Christ's own words. See, the thing about that era is that we actually knew what nuclear war would do, because the Americans had dropped a couple on real live cities, disintegrating 100,000 in one fell swoop. Those people learned real quick about sudden clouds and great power and glory, but the Son of Man did not come. Several months beforehand, Winston Churchill ordered the incendiary bombing of Dresden, dropping bombs whose sole design is to burst overhead, raining down fire on an entire population. 25,000 people died in the course of 3 days. The people under that cloud of fire also learned about sudden clouds and great power and glory, but the Son of Man did not appear. We have plenty of examples and opportunities throughout history to have seen the Son of Man appear because everything Jesus has predicted has come true, even without a worldwide nuclear conflagration. From the fig tree, learn its lesson, he says. As soon as its branch becomes tender and puts out leaves, you know that summer is near. Every evil thing that we can imagine has taken place and did take place very soon after Jesus said these words. After Jesus ascended into heaven, the apostles set up the church in Jerusalem as a base. Even 40 years later, in 70 AD, the center of the Christian church was still in Jerusalem. In the meantime, a terrible famine had taken place, compelling St. Paul to go to all the churches in Turkey and Greece to take up a collection for the starving Christians in Jerusalem. The whole place was in turmoil all the time, and not just because of the Jewish hatred for the Christians, but also because the Romans had just about enough of the Zealots, a militant Jewish party bent on expelling the Romans from the Promised Land. So the Romans set up a siege against Jerusalem, starving everyone inside. If you're a faithful Christian, and the Romans just spent a couple of years starving you to the point of death, and then they start burning down your city, and while they're destroying everything, you're going to look to the sky, waiting for those clouds, that great power and glory which herald the Son of Man coming to rescue you. But he didn't. But he is going to rescue you. It was the same thing for him when they shook their heads mockingly, saying, "He trusted in God. Let God rescue him. He saved others, ha ha, but he can't save himself." The sun was darkened and the earth shook, but the Son of Man hung there, as dead as you can be, and then buried. See, the Son of Man is your fig tree. Can you imagine any event worse than the crucifixion of Jesus? Can you imagine in all of heaven and earth, under the sun, the moon, and the stars, anything more dreadful than the Son of Man being brutally murdered? Even so, stay awake. The leaves of the fig tree have uncurled. He rose from the dead. Be vigilant, not afraid. Be ready, not cowering in fear. This time of the church is the time of our triumph, but not without heartache and tribulation. It is a time of victory and a time of hope. Victory over all evil and hope that the Son of Man will come quickly to bring it all to a glorious end. Right now, you are a witness to the resurrection, to the hope of the glory to come. Right now, you are saving many people with the message of salvation from this present evil age. As long as you are here, there is hope for them. Stay awake for the sake of your sons and daughters, for the sake of your neighbors. Stay awake for yourselves. He came back from the dead. He is coming back to judge both the living and the dead.